Good morning. Greetings to each one of you. Again, in the precious name of Jesus. I've really enjoyed our time of worship already this morning and considering the different truths of God. I'm going to laugh throughout the week often when I think of John just bailing it and hearing the loudspeaker to keep driving so he can be pulled over properly. I've had it the other way where I've needed the speaker almost to get me stopped. But anyway, I enjoyed that object lesson really of how we do life sometimes and take the truths of God's Word for granted. This morning I'd like to talk again about the entitlement mentality. We've been going through Luke chapter 4, and then we switched to Luke chapter 15 and the story of what we say the prodigal son. The focal point has often been the younger son, and this morning we would like to focus on the older son and his entitlement, his relationship to his father, and we want to, as we focus on the sons, we don't want to miss the father. As I study this subject, this story, this entitlement mentality, I find it easy to apply to my own life, as in it becoming personal, and especially this perspective of the older son. And interestingly, in the last couple weeks, one of the books that were assigned to be an option to read for the counselor training course I'm going to was The Return of the Prodigal. How many have read that? Daniel? And here, I had not chosen that book in my list of books to read, but I was able to listen to it on Spotify, and so it felt like a big bonus for the training I'm doing. Well, here it applied really, really closely to the study on entitlement. So I've been blessed tremendously by that consideration. And so we're not going to do a whole lot of review today. The points that we looked at last time so there's 4 signs that we have an entitlement mentality. The first one, we have an indulgent view of God. Second one, we choose emotions over truth and scriptures. So we looked at those 2 the last time I spoke up here. This morning we're looking at number 3 and 4. We rebel and refuse to pray. These are signs of entitlement mentality. And fourthly, our experience of life is isolation and bitter loneliness. And so I've been excited to share. I was looking forward to share this last Sunday and then hopefully share the follow-up closing sermon on this series today. But then we canceled last Sunday, and so we get to look at this subject this morning. So turn with me in your Bibles to Luke chapter 15, to the familiar account. You may want to just glance at it as I go through the rest of the content this morning. Luke chapter 15. And we're going to break into this story at verse 25. And again, the focal point is the position of the older son in the story, but notice also the father. And we'd like to draw some points from that as well. Luke 15 and verse 25 through 28. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked him what these things meant. And he said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. Verse 28, and he was angry, and would not go in. Therefore came his father out, and entreated him. We're going to stop there for this morning. So a couple of things, even before we get into more of the subject matter. As I was studying again, one of my favorite focal points is verse 28. Therefore came his father out and entreated him, and that in comparison to verse 25, now his elder son was in the field. And so, as we grow up and we study and we read this story, this parable, we hear it over and over and over. And there's different parts that stand out to you at different times of your life. But this position of his older son has been one that intrigues me as I consider why in the world was the older son still working when all this commotion was going on at home. There is rejoicing, there's preparations, and I'm longing for him to have a front row seat. And he's at the very least firing up the smoker for that fatted calf. Because maybe he can't put it in as many words to say, brother, I just love you, and I'm so glad you're home. Maybe he's not that kind of guy, but he's the kind of guy who's going and getting the fire ready, and he says, okay, I know what's happening. The fatted calf is going to be prepared for this celebration. This is incredible. And he would be in tune with his father. He'd be in tune with the family, and he would have witnessed the entire scene of the father running out to meet little brother. Instead, the older son was in the field. And if the older son was in the field, he was absent from the father. So notice this. The older son lives at home. The older son sleeps at home. But the older son is separated from his father. You and me, a lot of us, we go to church regularly. We live in the Father's house. I'm even a member of this congregation. But coming to the Father's house does not equate being in fellowship with the Father. I can work in the Father's field. I can sleep in the Father's house. But I can be separate and isolated from the Father. I can be angry in my Father's house, verse 28, and refuse to go in and fellowship where there is rejoicing. Can you relate? Can you relate maybe more to the younger son? And maybe your experience has been one of living a frivolous life of the prodigal. In my case, I can relate very closely to the older son, having grown up, in a sense, in the Father's house, having not strayed very far into the fields. And I can relate to being angry at the Father, being angry at the commotion to someone else who is blessed, who is loved, who is welcomed, and feeling entitled to some recognition myself because, God, I've always served you. And let's not miss the end of verse 28. Therefore came his father out and entreated him. I love this picture. And it's a picture of God, of God's heart as he rejoices over his younger son who's come home. He has equal care and concern for the older son who is angry. Because what did the father desire? He wanted fellowship with both of his boys. He wanted them both in his presence. He wanted both of them to experience his riches, his wealth, and more than anything, his embrace, just to have them close. Instead of celebrating his younger brother's return, the older brother became angry and refused to go to his brother's homecoming. Why did he want nothing to do with his younger brother, the homecoming celebration, or his own father? Can you relate to that? Have you ever, as a child of God, as a Christian, wanted nothing to do with the Father? Why did he refuse to go to his father and have a conversation, let alone ask what the celebration was all about, but instead called one of the other servants? Similar to this older son, there are times where I've refused to pray or want a conversation with God because I was blinded by my victim mentality, thinking everyone, including God, owed me for all the hard or diligent work I've contributed. Keyword, owed me. Have you ever felt that God owes you something? And if you have, don't be ashamed. These feelings of entitlement, this feeling of anger at the Father, this feeling of feeling isolated and what's going on, why doesn't God notice me, is not something to feel condemned about. These are experiences that we have. And it's as we accept and recognize our experience that we are in a position to start to recognize when the Father comes out to find us. The younger son, when he came to himself, in other words, when he started to realize the reality of where he was and what his condition was, what his circumstances were, where his choices had taken him, and taking responsibility for those choices, his longing for the Father was something he could experience. I have a quote here by Jim Detmer, who writes an article of entitlement, and it's titled, How to Become Resentful and Entitled. One of the destructive patterns we see in leaders and teams is the movement from obligation to resentment to entitlement. I'm going to read this, and I'm going to write some of these up on the board. The pattern begins by doing something from obligation. The essence of obligation is I have to. I have to is one of the cornerstone mentalities of victim consciousness. When I act from obligation, I sow the seeds of resentment. Resentment is a hardening of my heart, mind, and body toward anyone or anything that I believe is making me do something. For example, if I work on Saturday because I have to, in order to meet HR's requirements for performance reviews by Monday, there's a good chance I will resent whomever it is that is making me do this. But resentment is not the end of the process. Next comes entitlement. Entitlement is a belief I hold with certainty that I have a right to. When we do things from obligation and harden into resentment, our payback is our entitlement. So I'm going to write this little process up on the board for you to consider further. Obligation, which leads to resentment, and that payback is entitlement. And for me, as I read over this, that's more than I can digest, just as I read over it. And so I read it, and I read it again. And my intent is that when I recognize my anger at a given situation that really should be causing me joy, and maybe I see other people rejoicing with a given situation, and people are just thrilled, and I find myself isolated, resentful, and even angry at the joy that everybody else is celebrating. In those times, I want to reflect and break it down, because sometimes the entitlement is too much for us to accept or understand. So if we back it off to resentment, well, yeah, I can start to feel that. And then I say, well, what was I feeling obligated to do? What am I doing out of obligation? And all of that, often the flare-up is my anger. And I'm furious about something that I should be happy about. And start to work through that process. Obligation, I have to resentment towards whoever is making me do this, comes to entitlement. Entitlement is a belief I hold with certainty that I have a right to. And when we do life where we feel like we have a right to, it's definitely taken any fun out of it. And not that life is all about fun, but there's not a rest, and there's not a reward, there's not enjoyment in the process when everything is a right to. Entitlement can show up in many ways. Some examples, again, from this article, I had to go to dinner with clients so I could get the sale. I resent that my boss is not appreciating all of the extra time I put in with these late night dinners. I feel entitled to a bigger bonus for my extra hard work. And you might have your own example. Maybe this isn't something that applies to your experience. But when you think of things that you feel like you have to do, and maybe it's at home in your family, maybe it's at your job, maybe it's in the leadership team and things I have to do because of my responsibility and the expectations placed on me by others that make me frustrated. I have a right to. The older brother had every luxury and amenity one could want from a wealthy father, in addition to an inheritance he was looking forward to. Yet he was a victim in his own mind, and we'll see why as we continue the story. A couple of questions. Do you make choices and do things more out of obligation than inspiration? So, Sunday lunch dishes. Seriously, is it my turn again? I'm sure I took someone else's turn sometime, someday, like some week or month ago, but I'm sure, like, I deserve not to do it. Well, so I dragged my toes and my knuckles and sometimes my chin to the kitchen sink until, and the entire process can just be just grim. From the first dish till the last one. Or inspiration. So what if I would do this, not because I have to, not because it's my turn, but because I'm going to invest into team. And if we do the dishes together, then we'll all be ready sooner to go for a walk. Or the entire atmosphere changes. Whether I have to or whether I get to. And sometimes it's not at the get to part, but whether I can participate and contribute in one way or another. It transforms it. How do you respond when someone around you gets more gracious and generous treatment than you expected? Do you begin to resent them or rejoice with them? All right? So someone in school gets an incredible grade and gets a compliment from their teacher on their tremendous effort, and they're recognized. How does that affect you? I have this other question right alongside with that. How do you respond when you are recognized? Sometimes rejoicing in someone else's success is more comfortable to us than to allow the Father to gush over us. Can you relate to that? Do you love somebody else being praised, but when the thought of God speaking to you with appreciation makes you squirm? I find that often. One of the exercises we had to do at the end of Core 1 training at Life Ministries was ask for a blessing. And so from your small group, when it was your turn and your circle of 5 other participants and 2 facilitators, I had to ask my group for a blessing. I didn't do it, and they didn't notice, so they didn't reprimand me, and I got away with it, and I still got a blessing. It was really hard for me. To ask for a blessing for myself was difficult. And so some of the entitlement mentality can show up in a reverse order as well. Are you eager to pray or resistant to pray? Is there anything you hold against God rather than being humble with Him? And again, as I ask these questions and as we study this subject, my intent is not to slap you with a ruler, although that might be fun. But instead, as you consider these things, some of these are real to our experience. And as we recognize these things, if we respond in shame and saying, I am a failure, there's really, that end result does not end in a place of healing and growth. But if we recognize these things in our experience and accept that we do have possibly a false perspective of who we are, or we have a false perspective of how God views us, in the reality that you and I are not perfect, we hinder God's ability, not His ability. We hinder the blessing that could be ours by participating in what's true and breaking those chains of our own mentality can be really difficult and impossible for us to do on our own. And so guess what? The Father entreats us. The Father comes out to meet us. Don't ever lose that thought. When you are apart from God and out of relationship with Him, even as a Christian, the Father entreats. The Father approaches. He invites. He welcomes. He says, "Son, everything I have is yours." And we're going to get into that most exciting part of the story another time. Are you eager to pray or resistant to pray? All right, the next point. Our experience of life is isolation and bitter loneliness. Verse 29 and 30. And he answering said to his father, "Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment." All right? Older son, he's angry. The father comes out to entreat him, and he's like, okay, and it's time to vent. "Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment. And yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf." Do you hear, do you feel the son's anger? His loathing of the father? Do you hear his hatred of his brother? Like, he took your hard-earned money. He took our name, the family name. At this point, his younger brother, in the older brother's mind, all he can see is he's your son, Dad, who devoured your hard work for living with harlots. Okay, skipping entirely that his younger brother had repented. Skipping entirely that his younger brother humbled himself and came home penniless, completely dependent, repentant, and is back in fellowship with the Father. All he sees is that loser who does not deserve anything of any kindness, any love from the Father, and he was blinded by the fact that I have never been celebrated. When we're entitled, we no longer view God and other people as relationships. When we're entitled, we no longer view God and other people as relationships. Instead, we see them as targets and obstacles to blame for why we aren't experiencing more happiness and joy. The older son was resentful toward his father. He kept a record of all the nevers he held against his father. From his vantage point, his father had never thrown a party and never given him a goat to feast with his friends. He seemed to blame his father for why he didn't get to enjoy celebrating with his friends. The older son remained physically present at home, but he did not enjoy a close relationship with his father. He was isolated and bitter in his heart. choose to value the relationships you have. Choose to value the relationships you have. When I'm bitter and entitled, I miss opportunities to enjoy growing closer to God and closer to friends and family. Although I may be physically present, entitlement fuels bitterness that leads me to be relationally isolated. Rather than holding on to the nevers in our life and stunting ourselves from growing closer in our relationships, we can choose humility and gratitude. We can choose to value the relationships we have and deepen them through vulnerability. Have you ever said that? Never. We laugh sometimes. As children, I have memories, and I hear it in some others, where we're never allowed to do this and this, or we never get to go and do that, and you kind of grin because the inaccuracy of that is so obvious, because we're asking to do what we've done before, but we never get to. It's just never allowed. And we smile because it's not that important. But in those examples, do you see similarities to your relationship with God? To being in the Father's house, but being isolated. To making sure that the Father's farm operates perfectly. Because at this place, we don't take time for parties. We don't take time for frivolous things. The Father's account is in good shape because I'm making sure of that. But when it comes time to the Father celebrating, sometimes I've heard the term said prodigal father, because the father left all the norms of society and dropped all of those. When he saw his son coming, he ran. Not a real good feature for a respectable, wealthy citizen of society to just be running flat out across town to meet his son, who had devoured his inheritance. And we'll get to more of that story later, or next time. Do I have feelings of entitlement? Can I celebrate when God is gushing over somebody? And can I accept that that is the Father's love for me? For you personally? That God is this excited about you as his child? And more than a perfect record of, what did the Son say? Neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment. That's quite a record. That's no speeding tickets, John, like 0. No points off your license, and no pulling over wrong and getting reprimanded for that. So realistically, from an entitlement mentality, that wasn't true either. There's a chance this older son did do some things wrong, but some of us get pretty focused on making sure in our minds we're not doing anything wrong to the Father. But we are completely separated from a relationship with the Father? What do you prioritize over building close relationships? Question. What do you prioritize over building close relationships? Do you see God as an obligation or as a relationship? What do you think is the relationship between loneliness, bitterness, and entitlement? How can you defeat these? By turning to God with gratitude, changing the way you think, and prioritizing relationships. Let's read verse 31 and 32 in closing. And he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad. For this thy brother was dead, and is alive again, and was lost, and is found. Let's bow our heads to pray.